everyone, Novels Wonderland here. Thank you all for the love and support you've shown me and the channel.
Reborn is the first Nephilim Lord Leviathan, random note, chapter 90 to 93, chapter 80 for chapter by random note. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Alex was contemplating as they sat on their web, mulling over all that they now knew. For it was their job to know things, and it was a job they found quite enjoyable to say the least. Recently though they had been gathering information from the nations bordering Malstance in hopes of finding out the moves being taken by the wider world. It seemed to have been a good decision, for the army put together by the Council of the West had just recently found out about Blake's existence and his efforts to unite Malstance under his own banner. This came about from reports of a few scouts they had sent past the border in order to get a lay of the land, both physically and politically. It was smart, what any good army should do under a competent commander. That was part of what made Alex a bit nervous though about the whole thing. Naturally, the spider-like demon had made sure not all those scouts made it back though. A few assassinations in the night made short work of them. They only took that action due to the fact it was an unspoken rule that when sending scouts into enemy territory you were destined to lose a few. Whether that be to enemy forces, terrain, or just bad luck. They didn't kill all those scouts immediately though, some Alex interrogated for some more information. They tended to give it up with some liberal use of his convinced subskill, and some basic scare tactics involving shadow motion. Humans were scared of the dark instinctively, and the dark was where Alex made their home. It served surprisingly, or maybe perhaps unsurprisingly, very well as an intimidation tactic. In the end Alex got what they needed though. Rough troop counts, some of the involved factions, and the supply situation for them. From all that Alex was able to put together a good estimate of what they were dealing with. It seemed that the main threat were the forces led directly under their general, one General Gaunt. This force was receiving supplies from the council directly, and its men held the highest authority. They had the best weapons, the best supply lines, and the most clear command structure. It likely helped that their portion of the army also had no nobles playing politics, and trying to claim jurisdiction over parts of their force. The other factions in the army were far different. From the sounds of it, and from what Alex's mini-me's had confirmed, the others lacked in many ways. Command was more built on whose son you were, their weapons shiny, but their supply lines a cobbled patchwork thing. As one of the scouts said, the others looked more like boys playing at war hoping for glory without the fear of death. Alex then understood, these other forces felt confident in part due to the main force aiding them. General Gaunt's forces were akin to a safety net, one that needed to go in order for Blake to achieve victory swiftly. Naturally, Alex had relayed all of this information to Blake using some body doubles. The clones walked through the shadows with stacks of parchment reports on all that Alex had gathered that they found potentially useful for the young king. Though it also had the tendency to result in said young king groaning at the sight of all the parchment. Alex personally didn't understand, they thought the papers were a great use of their material creation skill that made it so much easier to share information. Perhaps it was a human thing. Then again, if that was the case maybe I'd get it, they murmured to themselves. Emma had said that Alex was a bit different from a normal demon in a few ways. At one point she even said if anything they reminded her of a demon that was a reincarnated human. When they asked why they received an interesting response. The human world is something that demons have to learn about, all their silly rules and customs a foreign and alien thing to us at birth. Primordials like myself are only so good at navigating them due to our long lives allowing us to study them. I in particular found an interest in their politics, the idea of something other than strength determining law an interesting thing that I wish to explore if for no other reason than how absurd it is. You on the other hand, you don't seem to have the problem that demons face when learning about humans. There's a kind of intuitive understanding with you in a way that normal demons don't have, she had told him, explaining the difference between Alex and the demons born in hell. The gray-haired demon found this to be somewhat interesting, and they wondered if perhaps it was due to how they were created. If their master's past life as a human influenced them to be like this. Or maybe it was due to never having stepped foot in the demon realm itself, only having lived here in the world humans called home. Either or both were likely to be the culprit, they thought. Though their train of thought became derailed when they heard the clicks and sounds from below them. It seems their latest endeavor has woken up now. Looking down, Alex saw the now larger form of what had once been a black widow. The spider had originally been the size of a normal member of her species, but now was roughly the size of a small hound after Alex had named her. She was found by Alex from one of their new body doubles in Eurasania, having fallen from her web with a broken leg. They'd rescued the little spider only to be surprised at sensing the magical density of her small form. From that, Alex deduced that she had likely been close to evolving into a magic beast of some sort. That only aided in making the results of naming all the stronger, though. Alex smiled at her then and reached out their hand to pet their new companion. As they did so, they spoke with a small smile. "Welcome, Ophelia, to the 8 limbs," they said softly, and got an excited chittering in response to their words. Blake looked over the reports of information Alex had recently sent before looking across the room at his advisors. After his declaration, they now sat down to plan what their next step was exactly. Each of the people at the table had a copy of the same reports, not just Alex's but the others made by their own men as well. Troop listings, supply charts, and other important logistics all were written down in black and white for them all to look over. Blake himself had already read over it all at least twice by now, but waited till he was sure everyone was caught up before speaking. After a bit of time, it seemed to be the case. So he cleared his throat before speaking. "So, as you have read, it appears that we face an army numbering somewhere in the range of 25,000 to 30,000 men. Meanwhile, we number roughly half that in our current state at 12,000 men. Naturally, an all-out battle is not in the cards if we wish to have any hope of victory." Blake began the discussion, spelling out their situation bluntly. Many in the room looked uncomfortable to some degree. Mainly the men from the army itself that represented the men. Bullet had a grim look on his face, same as Richard. Their experience in the military was perhaps the greatest in the room, even with Richard's young age. The two of them knew just what kind of a suicide move charging in for direct battle would be. They had faced the prospect of doing just that not too long ago with the trolls after all. Noctis meanwhile held a grimace on his face that showed what he thought of those numbers in and of itself. "Luckily, I have a plan," Blake went on, getting a breath of relief from a few in the room that they all heard. Richard spoke up then, one of the most comfortable with doing so, Blake had found out over time. "What is your plan, my king? Such disparities in our forces spell a likely end for us in almost all situations I can see," he asked, not disparagingly but more so to move the conversation along. Richard had faith in him, that the redhead knew. The young commander had long since placed his trust in his chosen king, the additions of the elementals now surrounding him aiding in that ever more. Though truthfully his trust was already cemented long before their appearance. Regardless, Blake nodded his way in acknowledgement. "My plan is such. The main force, one that numbers 20,000 all told, is what holds this assembled force together. My plan is to take out this main force, chiefly their leader General Gaunt. I will challenge the men to a duel, and should he refuse, I shall use my strength to decimate his forces in such a way that what I did to Mastiff Castle will look like a mercy. I am done losing men to pointless conflict, so I will ensure the head of the serpent is cut off in a show of force that will make the rest scatter." Blake told them his plan, punctuating his final sentence with a slammed fist on the table. The poor table only remained intact due to his control, and everyone in the room knew that. They had seen this man cleave through steel like cloth, and lift crates that would normally take 10 men to lift. It didn't detract from the theater of the moment at all though, instead they rallied still at his words. The charge of excitement at their king's words faded though, and Noctis spoke up this time. "What if he does accept the duel of my king? I doubt the death of one man alone will make them retreat." Noctis added his 2 cents to the conversation while pointing out a potential flaw in his liege's plan. Blake nodded once more, this time in Noctis's direction, showing that he'd heard the mun. "That is unlikely to happen from the reports. General Gaunt is said to be a highly pragmatic man that will not take any needless risks when working for those he has sworn himself to. Not even his pride is enough to make him take the more risky play, which the duel would be. But in the event that he does accept, I will employ my elementals to make a spectacle of the fight worthy of a coliseum. All the while squads of our men will covertly move to flank the enemy while they are distracted. He explained to them all his reasoning and his fallback plan. Some in the room were shocked at the proposed action from their king. It was not something that they would have thought he'd consider, and one of the men from the army stood up and asked his burning question. "But is that not dishonorable?" he asked in almost disbelief. Blake stared at him until the men sat back down before answering. Honor has no place on a battlefield. For honor is not worth more than the blood and suffering of the innocent that will follow should we be defeated. Honor does not weigh more heavily on my mind than the chains my people will once more bear should I fail. Honor has no place in war, for it is the one luxury that no true ruler can afford, Blake told the men, soon shifting to speaking to the entire room once more. The men in that room saw the conviction in their king, in both his words and his eyes. They knew then that he spoke the truth. What good was honor to the families that would starve under the rule of that army? Why would honor get them anything now when it never had before? The nation of Malstans had preached honor in military service, and yet that supposed honor only brought more death and suffering. They all nodded one by one, faces of matching conviction on their faces. Even the man that initially spoke adopted a look of sheer will on his face, recognizing the truth his king spoke. And just like that, they had their plan of action for how to deal with the force coming to return them to bondage. For whether they have chains of metal or chains of status it mattered not, both they swore they'd never return to. Edited, 5/25/2026 Chapter 91, Chapter 85 Chapter by random notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Lucian walked through the large castle that served as the home of his new nation's administrative body and its royalty. Behind him Shizu followed, quite for now having both come to the understanding that he needed to complete his duties as a ruler, and then get them to a more private area in order to continue their discussion any further. Initially after teleporting from the mountainside, Lucian and her had appeared outside the walls of the capital city, with the massive collection of refugees right behind them. Lucian had taken that time to talk with his subordinate, Emma, in order to deliver the order to set up a temporary camp outside the walls. Once he was finished speaking with the white-haired woman, one who Shizu couldn't help but feel was familiar in an odd sort of way, they had headed into the city. This had led to Lucian delivering orders to a litany of people as he walked, including a woman that had black hair with golden accents named Albiz, who met them at the foot of the building they now walked through. These orders included running a census of all the refugees, the supplies they took with them, and to start preparations for new construction efforts. It seemed that Lucian had something intended for the housing situation of the refugees that went far beyond a mere encampment. Eventually, though, they reached a secluded room that seemed to be in the royal wing. Walking through the door that Lucian held open for her, Shizu then took in the room. It was a large room, seemingly separated into sections that included the main one with a bed, and a side section with a desk overburdened with parchment. It was easy for her to piece together that these were Lucian's chambers, and a flush of color found its way to her cheeks despite herself. Seeing a small table with a few chairs around it, Shizu took a seat on one and waited for her guide to do the same. Lucian sat directly across from her and looked her in the eyes. For a while the two sat without speaking. After a few minutes the two started to laugh, neither sure who started. "We're being silly, aren't we?" Shizu said through her giggles after a bit, and got a nod from Lucian. "That we are," he agreed, a faint chuckle clinging to his words as he spoke. The two fell into a more comfortable silence then, understanding that despite their now evolving dynamic nothing had truly changed. They were still who they were, and there was no need to suddenly be more careful in how they acted with one another. With that out of the way, the two began to speak once more, reminiscing on their old travels and discussing inane topics as well. "And then Hinata looked so proud after I knocked one of those 10 great saints down in a few movements. She looked so adorable, like she was showing me off to them or something. I could hardly stop myself from laughing at her face." Shizu finished recounting a story from her time in the Holy Empire with her wayward student. Lucian shared in her humor, laughing along with her story with a brightness in his eyes that she rarely saw. It seemed like a weight was coming off his shoulders then, like he was relaxing for the first time in a while. She understood why though. The men she'd come to have feelings for had a habit of taking things onto himself for those he cared for. It fueled his desire for strength, she knew. The way he spoke of Blake and his spawn made it clear to her how much he cared for them. How much he would do to see them safe, and how much weight he would bear so they didn't have to. Shizu knew that he saw them all as his responsibility. Even Blake, despite his growth, was likely still that young man that Lucian took under his wing that needed his protection in some way. Shizu was the only one he'd met that wasn't either his subordinate, or someone he saw as his responsibility to protect. She knew he cared for her, but she wasn't someone fresh to the world that needed guidance and protection like the others were. He didn't need to be that figure of strength like he was for others with her, and she was glad to see it. That more than anything made something in her feel warm and fuzzy, that she could be that for him, and let him be himself with her. Lucian was always on edge, she felt. She saw it in how he talked with the others even before they parted. It was worse now, the stiffness to him that no one would notice without knowing him personally, in how he spoke with his subordinates was more clear to her. Especially with that Emma woman. It was like he was constantly putting on this air of strength for everyone, like he needed them to see him as strong no matter what. But here in this room telling stories and laughing, he didn't look like he was carved from the metal that was his name. Instead he looked like a man at ease with someone close, with a shine in his eyes that made her feel weak in a way she couldn't help but like. So, after what we spoke about before, I believe getting a room for you to set up here in the castle wouldn't be remiss. Unless of course you'd prefer to live in the city. I'm sure there's someone I could speak to about setting something like that up. Lucian spoke up then, rubbing the back of his head in anxiety as he seemingly grew awkward at the topic he brought up. Shizu softly smiled at him then, finding his reaction cute, at how him it was to her. I think a room here in the castle would be good. That way we could see each other every day, even if for just a little bit, she told him, getting a blush in response to her words. Lucian coughed a bit as if clearing his throat, seemingly forgetting that his body didn't need him to do that, and it was nothing more than a mental thing. It was things like that that showed to Shizu just how human he was despite being so far beyond one he was now. If she ever doubted his story of being a reborn human, such actions would have made them disappear in an instant. It also made it easier to grow closer to him, how human he felt, more relatable to her in a way that she couldn't explain. Though it seemed that she was just listing things she liked about him now in her own mind, and she couldn't help but blush once more at the thought. The two kept speaking for a while more, Lucian growing more animated as they spoke and more relaxed as well. It all made a thought come to Shizu's mind then. I think I made the right decision, coming here with him. It had been 3 days since Emma had come to the nation of Eurasania that her lord now ruled. She had spent that time organizing the settlement of the people under care. Temporary housing and the like being built with speed for them all, using some resources gathered from the surrounding area. In all it was going smoothly, though she knew this was only the first step. Her lord had told her about his planned project, mainly in expanding the capital city. From what she had learned, the culture of the nation resulted in the capital of Eurasania only allowing the strong to enter and live there, with scant few exceptions. Such a practice was fine for the completely strength and military-focused leadership that had been in place for centuries, but was horrible for her lord's own plans. Her lord instead found a way to increase trade and commerce, to make use of the nation's resources, and new ones that would come into play to make them more powerful economically. It was something Emma thought was only logical. Amassing power through wealth and trade could only be a good thing, and with the nigh untapped potential of Eurasania, there was much to be gained by doing so. This naturally required a greater workforce though, especially in the capital. A workforce that involved skills far more diverse than just raw power. In essence, in order to make themselves a more powerful country economically, they needed the weak. That left Lord Lucian with two options. The first was to disregard the tradition of his new people, and allow the weak into the capital without reservation. That was a poor choice though, that would naturally invite dissatisfaction in the populace. Emma knew that one of the best ways to alienate one's people was to disregard their beliefs and values. With her lord being so new to the position of ruler, this was an even worse route to take. That left them with option 2, the one he'd decided on, to reinvent and add on to the tradition. The plan was simple. A new expansion to the city would be constructed that would not have the same requirements of strength in order to live there. This would be dubbed the Outer City, with the original city being christened the Inner City. The Inner City would be the home of the strong and maintain the old tradition, while the Outer City would not have such a condition. This would also allow them to set up new industry in the Outer City that wasn't able to fit in the pre-existing city. Things like merchant halls, wineries and others that she'd heard her master speak of under his breath when she delivered reports. All those things needed space that the new Outer City would provide. This all was going through the back of her mind as she walked to her lord's office. Emma had been called in for a meeting, and she was preparing to receive orders in relation to the new construction efforts. So after knocking on the door as was polite and sitting down, she was not expecting the order she was given. "I think it's time we started talks with Dworgen, and I want you to lead them," Lord Lucian told her after she sat down, not mincing words and getting right to the point. Emma was a bit surprised at this order and voiced her confusion aloud. "I thought the plan was to wait a while longer on that front, my lord," she questioned without directly questioning her lord. Lord Lucian sighed then and looked down before regarding her once more. "That was the plan, but I have since reconsidered. Those people need to be sent home sooner rather than later. A dear friend reminded me of the more personal element of this all. Waiting to be in a better position is not worth the further suffering and pain of the refugees still there on the mountain and their families. As well, if it is revealed that we held back citizens of Dworgen simply to be in a stronger position ourselves, we could sour relations before we even get a foot in the door. It'd be one thing if the nation was in a time of upheaval or strife, but this has been a relatively peaceful shift of power. That is not a good enough excuse here, and so the best move would be to get them home as soon as possible. Hence, you are being given the order to go there and introduce both yourself as my envoy and the situation at hand," he told her, explaining in detail why the plans had changed. Emma understood immediately what the problem was. The potential insult to Dworgen could not be allowed to happen. They were a massive trading partner, one that had a desperate lack in one area, food. Eurasania was not a trade partner with the Dwarven Kingdom currently, but that could change in the future, what with her lord's attempts to circumvent the problem of spoilage that made long-distance trading so difficult for their nation. Putting these together made it clear what her lord intended to make Dworgen a trading partner, after finding such a solution in order to fulfill the other nation's need for food. This one agreement alone could change everything for them economically, she knew. And they just so happened to have a situation on their hands that could either give them an amazing in with them ahead of time, or greatly insult them depending on how it was handled. "This situation is of grave importance, my lord, I understand," she told him, and got a small smile in return. What she didn't know was that while Lucian was entertaining the idea of such a trade arrangement, he was more worried about the people themselves. Shizu had heard of the situation and aired her sympathies for the people and the families separated. It was a kind of small reality check for Lucian, and reminded him of the human element of the situation. It made him think about worried sick he'd be if Blake or one of his spawn was missing, and how angry he'd be that their reunion was delayed for something so petty as the reason he was using to put it off. Thus led to this discussion, though Emma knew not of this. "I'm glad you understand the situation, Emma. Due to its importance, I'm also greenlighting your request. You may go back to the underworld and gather your people before leaving in order to aid in this and further endeavors," Lucian told her, knowing that she would need help for all he would have her be doing in the future. As well, a delegation of a single person was a bit strange in his mind. So having some trusted aides go along with Emma only made sense. The smile on Emma's face though made him start reconsidering that decision though. "Oh, this will be fun," Emma thought with a smirk at the words, ready to start playing in the political arena of this world with relish. Dworgen was not prepared for her in the least. "We must be careful here. He's a demon lord, for crying out loud. We cannot accept the words of an envoy on his behalf at face value. One of the men in the chamber shouted out, standing from his seat in hopes to get the others to listen. Are you saying we should reject the return of our citizens? That our freed brothers and sisters will find their home barred to them after being released from chains? Another shouted back. Gazel rubbed his brow as he listened to his ministers bicker oh so loudly. Not that he could blame them, not after the envoy of a demon lord had so casually showed up to their border with over 100 people out of nowhere. The fact that she claimed them as merely her aides didn't help in the slightest. But the main problem was the message she'd come to deliver, that there were hundreds of refugees including citizens of Dworgen that were coming to seek refuge here. The fact that this included dwarves of Dworgen made this all the worse. Gazel hated slavery, especially of his people. To find out that so many were enslaved and then bought by the nation of Malstance made his blood boil. It also made him incredibly grateful that Lucian Silver had spared them in his battle against the now defeated nation, and even had them taken care of up till now. It seemed my instincts regarding you were right, Lucian Silver, the Dwarven king thought to himself before tuning back into the conversation with his ministers only to sigh. We have no idea if this isn't some plot by a new demon lord to put infiltrators into our ranks. We must conduct a full sweep and interrogation of them at the very least, the Minister of Internal Affairs shouted to the room. You would have us interrogate our own people, and other survivors of such horrors so freshly after being freed, before even letting them reunite with their loved ones? The Minister of Public Works shouted back, her old voice cutting through like a whip that would make any intelligent man be cowed. It seemed though that the Minister of Internal Affairs was lacking in either sense of survival instincts, perhaps both Gazel considered, as he shouted back once more. If it means keeping us safe then yes. Who knows what evil plot Demon Lord Lucian is cooking up? He yelled with force as his face turned an interesting shade of red. Meanwhile, far away in Eurazania Lucian sat at his desk cursing the invention of paperwork, and wondering if he could have Ivy grow some super coffee. He was starting to feel like he would need a dedicated supply with all the work he now had on his desk. One of my first orders as Demon Lord, growing super coffee. Oh how dastardly a villain I am, Lucian said to himself with a dry chuckle before going back to the reports with a groan. Edited, May 29, 2026. Chapter 92, Chapter 86. Chapter by random note. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Gazel took a deep breath before speaking up to address his ministers. As he did so, the king let a small amount of his aura leak from his person in order to further draw their attention. And so he uttered one word to calm the discord. Immediately after the word was spoken, dead silence reigned supreme in the room. Every man and woman in the room fell silent and sat down, almost entirely on instinct alone. None of them even looked chastised at the act, for they all knew one fact. When the king spoke, especially when he spoke like that, you listened and obeyed. It was law, it was fact, it was truth to them all. Some may have seen it as tyranny, they saw it as the natural due respect their king was deserved. For King Gazel was a hard but fair man who had led them well for over a century. So they all paid attention to his words as he went on to speak further after he saw his command heeded. This bickering is pointless and a waste of time. These are the facts. A new demon lord has sent an envoy to use in order to return our people to use. People who were taken into chains and bondage by humans, while we were all the while unaware of their plight. He has not come making demands, nor has he held them hostage for political gain. He laid out the facts to them one by one in a deliberate fashion. Seeing them all nod one by one as he spoke, Gazel continued, and decided to drop the pre-verbal bomb. Not only is Demon Lord Lucian Silver doing all that, but he is also a man who has aided Dworgen before. Months ago, before his ascension to Demon Lord, he was in this very city, and due to his actions a massive amount of corruption was discovered and routed out in our forces. A slaver and slave ring was also discovered and taken care of due to those same actions, with one prolific slaver being apprehended by Lucian personally. I have since considered him to be owed a debt by Dworgen and myself personally. As such, I will not have this man unjustly villainized for nothing other than the fact that he is a monster that has attained the title of Demon Lord. He pounded the table with his fist at the end, his words hammered into the skulls of the assembled ministers. With his words spoken, a murmur went through the men and women that helped in the ruling of his nation. They had evidently either not known of Lucian's exploits here those months ago, or hadn't connected the dots that they were the same person. Gazel let them talk amongst themselves for a bit to process this new information. After a little bit, one of his more intelligent ministers cleared his throat and addressed him directly. With that all being the case, my liege, what are your orders? How should we handle this situation? He asked, seemingly coming to the realization that Gazel had long made up his mind on what course of action they were to take. He smiled then a bit, one hidden by his beard so none saw his expression. It was nice to have some who could read between the lines, and was smart enough to realize the truth of the situation without Gazel needing to spell it out. We will accept the refugees, though they shall each be tallied and spoken to in order to gain their information. This information will be used publicly to find relatives, close missing persons cases our forces have had open, and to award compensation and relief funds to aid our displaced people in recovering their lives after their ordeal. Any that are not existing citizens of our nation shall be welcomed as well, and be given temporary group housing and aid in finding a place in our society, such labor jobs, or jobs that otherwise make use of their skills. Covertly, we will also be giving this information to our intelligence agency in order for them to investigate any discrepancies or suspicious persons in secret to ensure our security, without inflicting undue stress on these poor souls, he told them all, his words taken as law and none daring to challenge him on this. Gazel was glad of it, knowing that he was making the right decision here. This way he would ensure the safe return of his people, and gain a decent population boost as well. There were likely to be a few skilled workers in the mix of former slaves, for slaves were taught skills or forced to do manual labor most of the time. Once they were fully recovered, they would only be a boon to their industrial sector. Of course, it was also the right thing to do, but the benefits of doing so could not be ignored for a leader. This course of action though also ensured that they would not be caught unaware should Lucian Silver truly be using the situation to his advantage. Gazel doubted it, of course, but one did not trust instincts alone when leading a nation when it was easy enough to get facts. Instincts and intuition were for when facts were found thin and lacking, not when they were readily available and easy to get. Feelings must be balanced with logic and reason. This was his philosophy when it came to ruling, and it had served him well. He had no intention of abandoning this methodology now of all times. His ministers seemed to almost be ready to get up and leave, only waiting for the dismissal he'd yet to give. But he had one last thing to say though, one last message, an order for them all to hear. Also, we shall tell the envoy that we demand a meeting with their lord. I've wished to meet this Lucian Silver for some time now and judge his worth. Even more now that he is a demon lord that has entered the world stage. You are now all dismissed, he told them all, seeing shock on their faces, before they scrambled out of the room in order to act upon his orders. Soon Gazel was left alone in the meeting chambers with naught but his thoughts. As he contemplated the situation, he spoke aloud to the empty room. I hope you live up to my expectations, Lucian Silver. For your sake, and mine, he said in his deep gravelly voice before standing up and leaving the room himself. He had work to do, and a meeting to prepare for. Lucian sat on the throne of Eurysania, elbow on the arm rest with his head propped up with his closed fist. He looked to all the world as casual and unbothered. The sun shone through the back window in such a way that his silver hair was highlighted, as if forming a halo of light from the rays of the solar body. Internally the new king was in thought, considering things in regard to his new nation and its future. This included things such as their economic prospects, and their raw power in terms of available warriors. It was through these thoughts that Lucian came to one conclusion. I need them to get stronger, he thought to himself with a sigh from his throne. He ran through many ideas on how to increase his people's strength, with the help of Petra being instrumental in his planning for that and everything else. The Manus was essentially a supercomputer in terms of processing power, so it made running ideas through her a given in his mind. As such, he had been advised on what his most immediate course of action should be to increase his military power. Chiefly, granting Carrion and the Beastketeers a second name. Not only would this increase the four lycanthropes' power, but it would also further cement their loyalty to him. The established soul connection from naming would also be incredibly valuable moving forward in many different ways. Communicating over long distances would be easier, keeping tabs on them in case of emergencies would also be a breeze with Petra's capabilities. It was also the action that would see the most immediate results, and show to the public how strong his rule was. If even their former king was willing to accept a name from the new one, then they would have to acknowledge his rule then. With that decision made, Lucian called out to the aide that was stationed in the throne room to call for Carrion and the Beasketeers. The wolf lycanthrope bowed before hurrying off, her skirt flowing around her in her haste to the point he was afraid she'd trip over the garment. Thankfully, she didn't suffer any such misfortune and vanished into the halls of the castle in order to fulfill his order. Thus, Lucian was left alone to his thoughts once more. He went back to thinking about the future and the state of his new nation. Upon review of the forces and the reports on the military, one of the few things in their bureaucracy that had proper documentation that wasn't woefully inadequate, he'd come to a stark realization. That being that his army was terribly weak by his standards. To put it into perspective, Phobio was easily the weakest of the Beasketeers. Yet he was still head and shoulders stronger than even the next lowest ranking officer in their forces. Phobio was weak enough in Lucian's scale of power that even Alex, someone not suited for direct combat and still coming into their own power, would win in a straight fight 9 times out of 10. And Phobio was supposed to be one of his elite men. It was terribly insufficient for what he knew was to come. So he'd been considering various plans on how to increase the strength of his men. It was an idea from Petra though that seemed the most promising. "I believe an incentive-based reward system could encourage the growth of your forces," she'd suggested to him one night, when he was thinking on the issue. Lucian found himself liking the idea, though he soon ran into a problem. In this case, what he could reward his men with. Higher pay was essentially meaningless to his men, there wasn't enough luxuries or the like available to make having excess funds that important. Besides that, the economy in Eurasania was a mixture of trade and barter alongside a traditional fiscal system, with trade and barter holding more prominence here. So until Lucian could start introducing greater trade and better products, simply offering a raise was pointless. Acclaim and fame was a possible incentive, but a different project would be using that to increase the strength of his forces. That project would also take months to come to fruition at the projected rate of construction, so that wasn't a good option for his immediate future. Then an idea came to him: gear. Allowing for those who proved their strength to have access to stronger gear, and possibly techniques, was something that would speak to the lycanthropes he knew. True, actionable rewards for gaining strength that could be shown as status symbols was right up their alley. It had come to Lucian's attention that there was a large jewelry and weapon culture in Eurasania. It was how they showed off to one another, like how some animals made sure their coat was well taken care of or their claws were always sharp. Albiza's staff was one such case of this, and was part of the reason she took it everywhere with her. Phobio also had his armor to show off himself, while Sophia oddly seemed to be an outlier by not having anything like that. Well, except her fur and hair, that is. Lucian had heard the gossip around the castle, and apparently Sophia was known for taking great care of her coat, and such to the point she'd go down into the city and spend her paycheck on care products for it. It was her main expense, actually, considering that she didn't pay for food or board due to her position in the military. But in general, gear of any kind, be it weapons, armor or accessories, were things that the lycanthropes would value, and offering them as incentives was bound to be a good way of encouraging them to grow stronger. That all made him have another idea, one that had crossed his mind a few times actually. "I wonder if I could get Kai Jean and the others to come work for me here," he thought to himself. He wanted the dwarven smith and the 3 brothers here for a few reasons. Not just because they could make the gear he sought, but because he missed them a bit. Kai Jean and him had a strange friendship, and Lucian knew Blake would love to see them again. From the buzz he felt from Graham, it seemed his sword also wished to see its creator once more. The growing soul in his blade was a strange thing, but not something he chose to focus on for now. Instead, Petra's response to his thought drew his attention. I believe that should you bring it up in your talks with the Dwarf King, then there is a 70% chance that something like that could be arranged. Though certain concessions trade-wise may be required on your end to achieve this, his every faithful partner told him, making a smile grow on his face. Lucian however couldn't ponder the thought of Kaijin, and the others joining him for much longer. Carrion entered the throne room with his Beastketeers right behind him. They came to the foot of the throne before Carrion kneeled with the others following suit. Lucian held in the urge to sigh, having told the men he need not bow like this, but the lionmen did so anyway. So instead Lucian simply bid them to rise after a moment, which they thankfully did so quickly, and without unneeded delay. "My king, may I ask why you've called upon us?" Carrion asked respectfully, something that was still taking Lucian time to get used to. The Nephilim stared for a moment before answering the men. "I have called upon you all for one reason. I have a question for you all and I wish for you to answer honestly," he said to them, regal voice in full effect that made them all stand just a bit straighter. They looked to one another for a moment before Albiz spoke up. "We shall do as you wish, my lord, and give you our honest answer to whatever question you may have of us," she said in her polite tone of voice with a bow of her head. Lucian wasted no time then and asked the question he had for them. "How would you all like to be given another name by me?" he asked, getting shocked looks in return and stunned silence that echoed out in the hall. He had a feeling he knew their answer, but for now Lucian enjoyed the looks of shock on their faces. It had been too long since he was able to do such a thing, and it made a smirk come to his face then. "Oh, how I've missed this. Blake and the others are too used to my nonsense to react like this anymore," Lucian thought to himself with amusement as he looked on at the group before him to come to terms with what he asked. Phobio's reaction was the final straw though that made him laugh aloud good and hard. Edited, June 1, 2026. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote after you remove the spaces. Chapter 93, Chapter 87. Chapter by Random Note. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. After a moment of silence following Phobio's single-word question, it seemed that the gathered lycanthropes regained their senses. The shock had faded and now only contemplation remained for them. The 3 Beastketeers in particular looked to Carrion for some kind of answer to the question asked of them. Accepting a name was no small thing, and while Lucian may be king now, their loyalty was still mostly Carrion's first and foremost. The Lionmen had led them for centuries, had trained them each personally, and had even named each of them in turn as he did every high-ranking member of his army. Carrion was called the Beastmaster for many reasons, the number of named subordinates that he'd personally named being one of them. Almost 100 soldiers he'd named in his centuries-long reign, a small percentage of his thousands of armed forces, true, but more than most. Now the Beastmaster was being asked by his newly recognized better if he wished for a name, if he'd accept a name from the Mun, who had supplanted him as both demon lord and ruler. None of the Beastketeers knew how the one they still truly recognized as their leader would react. In the end though, Carrion came to one conclusion as to what he must do. "I must be stronger. For my country. For myself. And for my new lord," he thought to himself before reenacting what had taken place a short time ago in front of the true rulers of the world. Carrion knelt before Lucian, head bowed in gratitude. "I would be honored to accept a name from you, my lord," he said, voice solemn with the weight of his acceptance and all that came with it. The Beastketeers followed suit quickly, decision made in that moment. If their former liege was willing to accept a name from the contradiction, then they would as well. No hesitation, no regrets. Only faith in the man they had sworn to follow into hell and back, and his decision. From their bowed position they could not see the small smile on their new lord's face, nor the gentle expression in his eyes. What they could sense though was the warmth of his aura then, as if he'd injected calmness into his demon lord's hockey rather than using it for intimidation. The contradiction indeed, the assembled lycanthropes thought as one at the sensation. Lucian then walked down from the throne where he'd sat to receive them. Soon he stood before their kneeling forms and placed a hand on Carrion's bowed head. "Thank you for accepting my gift to you." Carrion Mahis, Lucian said to the Mun, voice kind and filled with power. Carrion glowed, power flooding his form as the new name settled into his very soul. Light filled him, strength in his body like never before coming to him then. He felt like he was more than he was before. Then, just as the power was about to settle, something greater came into him. A warmth like a burning ember of a hearth on a cold winter's morning. It was like his soul screamed out in joy then, as if something that had stagnated had been reinvigorated once more. Once the glow died down, Carrion looked at his hands in awe, as if unbelieving at what he found. What he found though wasn't observable to normal senses though, not in appearance at least. It was inside him that Carrion looked, and what he found was extraordinary. He felt closer to breaking through a ceiling in power that he hadn't even felt before. The strength and energy in his soul and body was chaotic for now, unsettled yet as if waiting for him to stretch it before taking on a more definitive form. It made him wonder if perhaps new skills were in his near future, or perhaps something else. What he was certain of was that his raw power was certainly greater, and would only continue to grow. With Carrion's naming done though, Lucian moved onto the stunned form of Albiz next. A hand was placed on her head as well, and the Nephilim spoke his words with care. I deem you, ever the tireless leader of the Beastketeers, Albiz Lamia, he told her then, making her glow a purple light then akin to Carrion's before her. When the glow died down, Albiz was now in her beast form, a large serpent now taking her place with scales of violet. A glow of energy seemed to come from beneath her scales, her form glowing faintly with power. Upon her reptilian head were 3 long golden horns, her now 25 feet long and 3 feet thick circumference form curled into a nest, and looking like a noble horned serpent from legend. Soon after though, Albiz shifted instead to her half form, much preferring the ability to use her arms, and having a humanoid upper half. Her long serpentine lower body is even longer than before, with scales glowing with a purple power to them. They seemed stronger, as if more akin to a dragon's scales than a mere serpent's with their splendor. From her head, where once a single horn sprouted in the center, 2 more had grown from her left and right temple respectively to make a trio of horns come together as if a crown befitting a queen. Her eyes were wide as she stretched out her body, getting used to the new changes that had come from her new name. Carrion looked on and reflected on Albiz's new form. She likely was forced into this form from the naming. I was spared a forceful shift due to my unique skill most likely, though I'll need to check if there has been any changes regardless later in private, Carrion reflected, a proud grin on his face at seeing his subordinate growing stronger. Lucian wasn't done though and moved over to the stiff form of Sophia. Once more he placed his right hand upon the crown of her head and spoke her new name into being. Rise, you who embrace lightning's call, as Sophia rage you forevermore, he uttered for them all to hear. An electric glow came from her form then, the tiger woman seeming to almost spark with power from her fur. Her coat stood on end, and when the glow died down, a colossal tiger, with white fur so bright it looked like lightning itself, stood before them all. Sophia had had a large form in her beast form, but now she stood taller than even Lucian by a good foot, even on all fours as she was. Her fur sparked as if her power was too much for her physical form to contain, and was seeking release. She then released a roar that shook the hall, and was surely heard by everyone in the castle, and perhaps beyond into the city as well. Lightning arched off her then as she roared, the ground being scorched, and the others only remaining unscathed due to a hasty raised barrier on Lord Lucian's part. Sophia calmed after a moment and shifted back to her humanoid form, a sheepish look coming to her face then. There were some minor changes to her human form, perhaps a bit taller, and her body had greater muscle definition, but that was about it. Lucian merely chuckled as she rubbed the back of her head in embarrassment. I don't know what came over me there, sorry boss, she said with a small blush on her face at her actions. Lucian laughed it off though with a wave of his hand. You were excited was all, and no one got hurt, so it's all good. Just next a bit of warning may be nice, huh? He told her teasingly, and got a hasty nod in response from the one known as the White Tiger Claw. Finally the silver-haired man came up to Phobio's still kneeling form. With a repeat of the same gesture he did for the others, Lucian declared his name with purpose and weight. Finally, the black leopard Fong, I christen you Phobio Deimos, he said with grand finality in his words. Phobio glowed black then, befitting his title as he was reborn in power and strength. When the light died his form was revealed, a large leopard with black fur and blood-red crimson spots. His form was smaller than Sophia's had been but still stood near 5 feet tall on all fours. But what drew their attention most was the black flames that cloaked his form, as if his fur transitioned to pure fire instead of growing longer. They crackled with a heat that left scorches on the floor, making Carrion briefly lament all the damage the floors of the throne room was receiving that day. In the end though the damage was meaningless before the power his most trusted followers were receiving now. Phobio slowly shifted out of his beast form, not being used to it due to how seldomly he used it in comparison to the other beastketeers. His human form was revealed in short order, now with a slightly greater height, and somewhat longer hair that looked more wild now. It was as if his hair now was reminiscent of the black flames that had just wreathed his form but a few moments ago. Like the others he stretched his new body, closing and opening his hands in particular. Carrion took in the sight then of his 3 beastketeers, pride brimming in his heart at their new power. His own strength had grown as well now, and something new had entered him in his naming that made him be filled with warmth. It all ultimately cemented in his mind one thing, one thought that he believed with utter certainty. Following him, trusting him, was the right choice indeed, he thought to himself as he looked at the noble form of Lucian. It was then that Carrion knew he'd never regret bowing his head to this man for as long as he lived. That was fact in his mind, one written in stone, and engraved now in his soul quite literally. Emma waited patiently in the assigned room given to her for her short stay in Dworgen. The people sent by the nation's government to show her to the waiting room had been quite wary of her, as was to be expected. They had left soon after with a certain haste that she couldn't help but smile at. The room she was in was a simple room, one furnished with rich wood furniture with bright walls that one may not expect from dwarven architecture. There was a table made of mahogany, likely imported from one of the human nations, that had a few upholstered chairs around it of reasonable comfort. It honestly reminded Emma somewhat of the sitting rooms found in the castle of Blanche back in the day. Thankfully though she wasn't alone here, as being utterly alone would have been a show of weakness in these circumstances. Though they had restricted her from bringing in all of the subordinates she'd brought to their gates. So instead of the 100 of her kin that she arrived with, Emma brought only 2 of her aides along. She was content with this arrangement, honestly preferring it to a certain degree. The numbers even being but a small amount of the demons she has under her in truth, and just being what she could gather on short notice, were a good intimidation tactic to make them take her seriously. However it became cumbersome, Emma felt, to arrange the room for them all in foreign territory that wasn't expecting them. So instead leaving them outside as a subtle message was good enough for her, and she still got to have 2 subordinates to project some strength in the coming talks. Emma had done as she was instructed and given the message her lord commanded be given to the Dworgen leadership. She had yet to meet the king himself, instead having been met with a guard captain that went higher up the chain of command. This had led to her waiting at the gates of Dworgen for a time, as presumably the message of her arrival, what she came for, and who she came on the behalf of, was passed up the proverbial food chain. In the end she wound up meeting with a minister of some sort that ultimately led to now as a council meeting of the governmental body of Dworgen was called. Turning to one of her aides, Emma spoke a command through thought communication. "Scan the area for any wards or signs of magic. I want to know if they're keeping tabs on us," she projected to them and received a nod in return. Emma could of course have done so herself, but she wished to pass on such a plebeian task to her aide. She didn't truly care if they were spying on them, in fact she expected it to be honest. To not do so would almost be an insult in her mind, as if they didn't consider her enough of a threat or of enough importance to keep an eye on in the heart of their territory. The idea though that they could use any such information against her was laughable though. Sure enough though, her aide responded with confirmation of a few such spying spells. A listening charm in the table's decor was present, a vase of flowers serving as more than a way to brighten up the windowless room. Another spell was in the walls themselves as well that seemed to keep tabs on any signs of life, likely to ensure that the same number of people who entered the room was all that were still within it when the king arrived. Summon magic and spatial magic could make an ambush with greater forces remarkably easy, after all, and even the strongest could be laid low and struggle against a well-prepared sneak attack. She found the spells adequate, though the fact that they could be sensed by her aid made it clear to her that they weren't overly hidden either. There was another reason that Emma had asked her aid to do the scanning other than just her desire to not do so herself. Her aid was only average at sensing, though in human terms, she might have been considered a prodigy. But for demons, ones who lived and breathed magic, sensing magic was nigh second nature to them. Her subordinate was nothing more than a greater demon, but her weakness had its uses as it let her more accurately gauge the skill and strength of others at times like this. For before Emma's own prowess all looked quite inferior to her. Her other aid was here for a different purpose. He was an archdemon that had stood undefeated for a mere few hundred years. However, he possessed the unique skill recorder, one that let him record and play back information for others or himself to study in detail. It made him a great secretary and a good find in Emma's opinion. It would also allow her to show her master directly the coming meeting. The fact that it saved her from needing to submit the paperwork report that would only add to her lord's ever-increasing amount of parchment was also a very good thing indeed. Perhaps I'll even earn some praise for lightening his work, if ever slightly, she thought to herself with a small smile. Emma began to consider if she should ask about her master naming some of her subordinates, in particular her right-hand man that she left in the demon realm to run things for now and gather the rest of her kin, when the door to the room opened. It seemed that she'd lost track of time, and a few hours had passed. Now, entering the room was the man she'd been sent to speak with. One King Gazel Dwargo. So you are the envoy sent by the demon Lord Lucian Silver. The gruff voice of the king said, his question cutting straight to the point and coming out more as a statement than anything. Emma stood up to greet him then, and dipped her head in small courtesy. Just enough to show respect, not enough to show subservience. It was the same way she'd seen Blanche great visiting nobles before, one that impressed upon the other person that they were not above her in any way. It seemed the king and the two men he brought with him understood from the way they looked at her afterwards. I am indeed your majesty, my name is Emma Swan, and I've come on behalf of my lord Lucian Silver, she confirmed, doing the obligatory pleasantries that were required. Gazel sat down then with the air of a ruler, somehow drawing the room's attention to himself with the simple act of taking a seat. Good, then let us commence. I have heard your message and am willing to accept the refugees. Of course, a process of meeting each of them and seeing if they have any family remaining alongside gaining our own census of them will be done once they arrive, he told her, not mincing words and telling her the decision reached by him and his nation. Emma nodded along, having expected such a thing to be done by Dworgen. It was a way to discreetly scan for spies in addition to the stated and obvious reasons. Luckily, she had decided to not send in any spies to pretend to be refugees, though the idea had crossed her mind. In the end, though it was a bad idea, the risk of discovery was too great, and would only alienate the dwarven nation, which was the last thing she wanted. That would surely upset her lord. Besides, if we ever need intelligence on this nation's happenings, Alex should be able to easily gain it, she thought to herself before responding to the king. That is great to hear, and the process you mention is only natural and was fully expected. If we can provide any aid in the process at all, we'd be more than happy to, such as providing records of our own census of the refugees, or the like, Emma told him with a pleasant smile that had been crafted over hundreds of years for meetings such as these. The king grunted then, more a sound of consideration and acknowledgement than agreement she could tell. Then he spoke up once more, a different matter being spoken from his lips now. In addition, I wish to meet with your lord at the earliest convenience. I believe there is much to discuss between us, and I will have it done in person, not through a courier, he told her, though both knew it was a command wrapped in courtesy more than anything else. Instead of taking offense like some may have in her position at the command from a foreign leader, and one that had yet to earn her respect other than the respect her lord's words had earned him, Emma smiled a coy and true smile. When next she spoke, she sounded more like the millennia-old political savant she was, like a shark that smelled blood in the water. Oh, that's just perfect, for my lord wishes to speak with you as well, King Gazel, she said in a near purr of satisfaction at her goal being so easily met. The fact that her voice seemed to make the two men that came with the king shiver a bit made her smile grow just a bit sharper. It seemed her past thoughts were indeed correct, this was going to be such fun for her. Edited, June 5, 2026. I have made a Patreon that grants access to the next 2 chapters early as well as access to a Discord as well. It is at Patreon/randomnote, after you remove the spaces. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Novels Wonderland.